Okay, in this session we're going to be talking about executing in the process of leadership. We've talked about the vision phase, we've talked about the planning phase. Now this is where you roll up your sleeves. Well, by now you should have already rolled your sleeves up in communicating and putting a plan together, but you're going to start actually executing it. J. Oswald Sanders made this statement in his book, Spiritual Leadership. The man who possesses vision must do something about it, or he will remain a visionary, not a leader. And you can have a vision, but as a leader, you've got to move to the point to where you execute. And I have seen so many situations where you have a visionary, but no execution. Now, there are some people that their skill set is better as a visionary and maybe not as good as someone to execute. So that leads to the question, what about if you're a leader of an organization and you're a really good visionary, but then when it comes to actually making things happen, you struggle with that? What should you do? Well, one thing is you can try to improve your skill set in execution, but probably the most direct way is work with someone. That's why teams are so effective. You put people on a team with different skill sets so that they can complement each other. In other words, a strength here might offset an opportunity for improvement there. And so you end up with this. And I know I've worked for men before that were great visionaries, but when it came to actually executing it, they had difficulty. But when they were successful is when then they would hire someone or put someone on their staff that was good at executing. So there's ways to do this. So I want to talk with you about some of these skill sets, and either you need to develop them yourself or you need to find someone to work with that has this skill set. Delegation and empowerment. This is where it starts in execution. They're necessary for a leader to leverage his efforts and the followers to assume ownership. Remember that enlisting? And this is truly where you start to engage people in implementing the plan or implementing the vision. Again, let's refer back to the example we're using. What about Nehemiah? We left off where he did an assessment himself. He saw what needed to be done. He brought the people together. He communicated the vision to them. They accepted the vision. Then what did he do? Could Nehemiah by himself rebuild the walls? You say, well, possibly, but probably not in his lifetime. So he needed people. And what Nehemiah did was then he delegated responsibility. What he did was he divided the wall up into specific segments and assigned those segments to different families. That's delegation. And empowering people. So often a leader will delegate, but they won't empower. Don't you love to get on the phone with a customer service representative that has no empowerment? Now, if you think it's frustrating to you, you can imagine how frustrating it is to them. Because all they get to do is listen and they can't make a decision. And part of delegating is empowering people to make decisions. And as a leader, that's not always easy. Sometimes it's like, I can do it myself better. And chances are you can. but I would say a good percentage of the time they can do it better than you can. But we don't want to lose control. I had a guy that I knew in the corporation once, and he was sort of the old mindset. And he said, "Man, you got to be careful. You can't turn the asylum over to the inmates." In other words, it's like you got to keep control. But this is not what Nehemiah did. He delegated and empowered the people in the sections of the wall. As a leader will never accomplish all that God had in mind unless he delegates to his followers. The leader's effectiveness is leveraged by his leadership ability. Leverage is the key. You've got to leverage. As a leader, let me pose a question. If you spend most of your time with individual effort and little time with leadership, how effective is that going to be? Let me give you a graphical representation of that. The horizontal axis is the leadership contribution. The vertical is individual contribution. And that area represents effectiveness or what you get accomplished. Now, sometimes some organizations will try to push a leader that this is what we quote in a church, like this is what we hired you to do. You're supposed to do all of that. Bad mistake. A leader cannot do, even though they're capable, if a leader spends all their time doing the individual work themselves rather than providing leadership, you're not going to get much done. Look at this. What if you spent more time on leadership contribution, less time on individual contribution? You're going to end up accomplishing more and being more effective. That's why I said you see a lot of churches in the 50 to 60 range, because expectation or the pastor is supposed to do it all, or someone on the staff. You've got to involve people. This is the engaging part. And in delegating, you have to remind people. Example, I had a guy that worked for me. Very capable individual, but young. And so he was what we would call an area line manager. In other words, he had a whole part of a state that he was responsible for. And so we had a tornado come through and just really take out a small town. And so this was in his area, so he was responsible for oversight of restoration of power in that area. And so I was sitting in my office and I called him up, called his office, and I said, let me speak to Mike. Mike's not here. Where's Mike? Oh, he's down there with the crews. I said, okay. So I called Mike up on his cell phone. I said, Mike, where are you? Oh, I'm down here, with storm restoration. I'm here with the crews. And I said, okay, who's giving oversight and coordinating the whole effort? Because you see, we had other little towns out too. There was a long pause on the phone. And I said, tell you what, if you want to work on the crew, we can arrange that. Now, it's probably going to mean a pretty substantial cut in your salary. But if you want to be the area line manager, I suggest you get back and coordinate. And sometimes as leaders, there is this pull, because generally we enjoy doing some of the work. And it's easy for us to get pulled down into it. And then also your followers will encourage that. There was a great article written in the Harvard Business Review a number of years ago, and it was called "Who's Got the Monkey?" And so it used that analogy of someone coming into your office with a monkey on their back, and their objective is to leave the office with the monkey on your desk. Now, has that ever happened to you? Have you ever had an employee in your business that they've got a problem and they bring it to you and they want to leave it? And so the whole article was about how to make sure when they left the monkey was still on their back. And as a leader, we have to do that. We have to assist them, aid them, but we have to let them handle the problems. This idea of delegation, it requires a clear description of responsibilities and expectations. And this is where sometimes as leaders we try to delegate, but there's a set of skills in delegating. And it has to be clear. And when we give expectations to employees, there's at least three things it ought to include. The quantity, how much, the quality, and the time. In fact, if you have staff meetings, there ought to be action items. Sometimes I find that staff meetings tend to be therapeutic. Everybody talks about it, and nobody does anything. But they feel better about it after they leave, until the same problem exists. So there ought to be an action item in your meetings. It ought to be what's going to be done, who's going to do it, by when. And then you hold them accountable. And this is part of delegation. To be effective, delegation empowers followers with the authority to make decisions. You cannot delegate something to someone to do something if you don't give them the power to make some decisions to make that happen. A tremendous example in the Bible is Moses. Now Moses got some really good information, some recommendations from his father-in-law, a gentleman by the name of Jethro. And if you look over in the book of Exodus, and Moses' father-in-law said unto him, the thing that thou doest is not good. Now what was it he was doing that was not good? Okay, here's Moses with millions of people. He moves them out. God says, here's what I want you to do. Move these millions of people from Egypt to the Promised Land. So, people are people. There's going to be problems. And so after this exodus and the parting of the Red Sea and the Shekinah glory of God, the cloud, by day and the fire by night, you get out in the desert and all these people start grumbling and griping. And they have problems and they want somebody to solve it for them. And so what was Moses doing? He was trying to solve their problems. He was personally trying to listen to everyone and solve the problems for them. Now we're talking millions of people. You can see how ridiculous this is. I can just picture this long line and Moses up at the front of it, and he's, okay, you tell me what your side is, and you tell me what, okay, this is what we're going to do. Next. And it just wore him out. Now as a leader, you can get in that situation. But Moses' father-in-law said, Moses, look, why don't you do this? Why don't you put a person, capable people, over 1,000, then over hundreds, and over tens. And let them make those decisions. Now if there's a decision which they just absolutely cannot make, then bump up the line. That made all the difference in the world. Instead of being hunkered down in the desert, down in the nitty-gritty, Moses was able then to keep his intimate relationship with God, to look at the big picture and move the people on. And as a leader, that's what you're going to have to do. So you've got to give people the power to make those decisions. One other thing about that is a guy told me once, a good boss of mine, and he made this statement. He said, delegate to the lowest level possible. What does that mean? That means if you walk into the Verizon store and your phone won't work, that the person you're talking to can make a decision what they're going to do about it. You don't have to go up several supervisors or make the call to the office in Little Rock or wherever. You need to delegate down to the lowest level possible, because that allows people to own what you're trying to do and to make the right decisions. Now it's incumbent upon the leader to train the people how to make those right decisions. And don't micromanage. If you delegate, you need to oversight, but don't give a responsibility to a follower and then tell them exactly how to do everything. And then follow back over them and say, well, you should have done this, you should have done that. Do you know what's going to happen? They're going to hunker down and let you do it. And that's not the purpose. The purpose is to delegate down so that you empower them and you train them to do as much as they can. You have a happy employee and you're much happier. Now, just a caveat. Well, let me hold that one until we talk about accountability. Finally, the leader must match responsibility and authority to ability while providing the necessary training and support. We said that, but what does that mean? Responsibility without authority or training is extremely frustrating for employees. Now, I know this would never happen in a church, right? Would you teach this class? Here's a book. Go in there. Or we need somebody to do something and we want you to do it, but we're not going to give you any training. Or maybe you put someone in there that is really not capable. We're all, I think quite frequently, we end up with being guilty of that. And it's not just in the church world, it's in the corporate world too. A lot of corporate training is sink or swim. I can remember a lot of positions that I had like that. Like, here's your new position, bye. And then you had the opportunity to sink or swim. Of course, I got to the point I really enjoyed that. But anyway, sometimes it's not too fun when you're about a foot under gurgling and you don't know which way to go. So training is necessary. Now let's talk about accountability. It amazes me how we can say in the corporate world or in the academic world that we need to hold people accountable, but yet we can't do that in the church world. Now let me ask you, what is more important? Some of the things that a corporation is trying to accomplish, or what God's church, the body of Christ, is doing? Which is more important? But we tend to back off and say, oh, you don't understand. This is a volunteer organization and you can't hold people accountable. You better. Do you know why? Because God's holding you accountable. I can guarantee you that. As a leader, God holds you accountable. And you are negligent. You're a derelict of duty if you have people that you're responsible for and they are not accomplishing what they need to be accomplishing and you do nothing about it.
That's right.
Now, some of you are sucking air. Let me give the second verse. You need to know how to do that. You need to know how to do that effectively. Because probably some of you are thinking like, man, I can't chew somebody out. Well, the purpose is not to chew people out, but to hold them accountable. And you can do that in the right way. Again, using Nehemiah's example, there were a number of people who were abusing other people, their brothers. What was happening was some of the people weren't as affluent. I mean, they had come back to rebuild the walls. Some of them weren't as affluent as others. And so they needed money to live on. And so you had other more affluent people loaning them money at exorbitant rates. And so Nehemiah addressed it. He went to those people and addressed it. He held them accountable. There were also some people that they weren't building their part of the wall. He held them accountable. So how do you do that? It's a must. And in fact, I say it's even more important in the church world than in the business world. God has always held man accountable for his actions, from Adam and Eve in the garden to the judgment seat of Christ or the great white throne judgment. Now, basically, we're all going to be accountable. God's going to hold us all accountable. Now, there's some benefits of holding people accountable. Number one, accountability maximizes accomplishments by motivating both the leader and the followers. So, when you hold someone accountable, it motivates you. Because you know that I'm held accountable, and part of what I've delegated out is going to be the responsibility of those people, and if they don't perform, then what? Part of my responsibility is not being fulfilled. So, Proverbs 27 and 23. Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds. I use that verse a lot when I teach on finances. In other words, you need to know what's going on. And as a leader, if you're holding people accountable, then it's going to require you to know what's going on. Let's talk about how do you hold people accountable. Accountability must be administered by a specific set of actions. It's a learned behavior. Delegating and holding people accountable doesn't come natural. In fact, for most young leaders, it's a little bit intimidating, because sometimes as a leader, you have people that work for you that are more experienced, they're older, but guess what? God's put you in that position for the benefit of those people and to accomplish His objectives. So how do you delegate? Well, develop a clear set of expectations. Sometimes leaders get to be lazy. They say, I want you to go do this, but they don't tell you what this is. They tell you, well, do it, and when I see it, and it's what I want, then I'll know it. I call that the right rock principle. And that's, suppose I ask one of you to go out in the parking lot, would you go out there and get me a rock? Sure. So you go out there and you pick up a rock and come back and you say, well, yeah, but I need a bigger rock. Okay, so you go out there and you throw that rock down, you get a bigger rock. You bring it back in. Well, yeah, but that's not the right color. Okay, go back out and throw that one down, and you bring in the right color and the right size. Well, but it's irregular. I need it to be smooth. Now, by that time, they have an idea of what they want to do with that rock. They're frustrated, and by that time, you're probably frustrated. Would it not be easier to say, would you go out parking lot and get me a rock? It needs to be about this size, and this is the shade I really need it, and it don't get a regular one, be smooth. And they come back in. Everybody's happy. Now, in the first case, how much time have you wasted? How much effort and how much energy? As a leader, you can wear your people out by not giving clear expectations. You frustrate them. You're ineffective. In fact, I call that lazy leaders. In other words, go do something and then bring it back, and if I like it, I'll let you know. As a leader, if you're going to delegate, you need to give clear expectations. Exactly what you want. What it's to look like. What time frame. What the cost is supposed to be. Clearly communicate those expectations. You can have it up here, but if you haven't clearly communicated it to people, then it's not. And that's a whole another study and subject on communication. But you've got to clearly communicate it. You track and measure expectations. You can write this one down. Do not expect what you do not inspect. Do not expect what you do not inspect. Let me give you an example. What would happen, those of you that have kids in the home, if you said, I want you to clean your room up, and you never went behind and checked them? How long would it take them to figure out you're not really serious about this because you never check on it? And that's why when you delegate, you need to give people clear expectations, but you need to inspect. Why? Because the performers want you to check because they want to show you what they've done. The non-performers don't want you to check, and you better check. But I would go so far to say that it has more of a negative impact on the performers than the non-performers. Because if someone tells you something is important and they never check on you to see how it came, you demotivate people. I had a boss once, frustrated me to no end. I knew we had a yearly annual evaluation. And when I moved into that department, guess what? No evaluation. Well, there was an evaluation. It got filled out and sent in, but he would never sit down and talk with you about it. Frustrated me to no end. So, went into his office, closed the door. And I said, how am I doing? Oh, you're doing great. I can't be doing everything great. What are some areas that I need to improve? Oh, you're doing fine. You know what that told me? He had no clue what I was doing. Or if he did, he didn't care. And I was frustrated. You need to inspect. When you delegate, you need to follow behind and see what's going on. You track and measure those expectations. Now, important. When you delegate, you provide frequent and timely feedback, both positive and negative. Now, this is extremely difficult for most people. A lot of people, it's hard for them to sit down one-on-one with someone and say, this is what's going right and this is what's going wrong. But it depends on how you do that. I've seen leaders, well, they really weren't leaders. Maybe they were bosses, but they weren't leaders, to do this the wrong way. Let me give you just a rule of thumb. Praise in public, correct in private. Praise in public, correct in private. Now, why do you want to do that? Because you want to encourage people. When you praise in public, you encourage that person. Plus, the other performers, they get a little jealous. That doesn't mean you don't praise them, but you praise them too. And then the people that aren't performing, sometimes it makes them a little uncomfortable. But you always correct in private. never dress somebody down in public. Now, sometimes, well, we'll talk about this in just a second. But let me, it's what's called the shotgun approach or the rifle approach. Now, the shotgun approach is this. You just blast everybody if you have to correct. The rifle approach is you address the problems. Let's take an example. Suppose you're the manager of a department and you've got 30 people in there, and there's 3 people in there that are either abusing sick leave or maybe they're late habitually. You can use the shotgun approach and you can pull everybody into a meeting and say, this is what the policies are, this is what you're supposed to do, I want everybody to be here on time. What have you done? The people that are there 10 minutes early, 30 minutes early, how do you make them feel? And the people that are late probably weren't even there because they were late for the meeting. In other words, they're wandering around, they're looking around, I wonder who he's talking about. Because normally they don't care that much anyway. And so the biggest danger is not that you don't motivate the person that has the problem, but that you demotivate all of the people that don't have that problem. Now, I've seen some pastors get up in the pulpit and blast the whole church for specific individual problems that should have been addressed individually and privately. And that's not easy. To be honest, it's easier to get up in front of a group of people and talk to everybody and tell them what the rules are and so forth, rather than to go one-on-one and say, hey, here's a problem. Let me give you an example of what that might look like. I had a guy once that he was building a house, and the corporation I worked for had a sick leave policy, and they had, I don't remember, maybe 10 days a year or something less than that maybe, they could be sick. And so let's call this guy Frank. So Frank was building a house. And when I came into that organization as the new manager of it, I got to looking at sick leave records. And Frank was sick a lot of Fridays. Now see, the people in that group, they already knew what Frank was doing. And see, that's the key. People that you're leading, they know where the problems are. And they're wanting to know, what are you going to do about it? And so this was the hand phase. I was new, said so on the door that I was the manager of that area. And so they're sitting there like, I wonder what's going to happen now. So I could have taken the shotgun approach and pulled everybody in and said, now, this is the company's sick leave policy, and you don't take it unless you're sick. And so some of those older heads that had been there forever, and they had 10 years without a sick, you know how that would go over with them. So I took the rifle approach. So one Friday morning I was sitting there and Frank's wife called and says, Frank is really sick today. I said, really? Well, tell him I'm sorry and hope he gets to feeling better. That was about 8 o'clock, 8:30. So about 10 o'clock I did my Christian duty. I went to visit the sick. And I knew where Frank was building his house, so I went out there. And there was his car. So I parked the car and I started walking through the house. And I couldn't find him. I thought, that dude saw me. He saw me coming and he broke and ran in the woods. But I heard a noise. And so I walked around the back of the house and there was old Frank. Had a airless spray gun and he was painting some siding on the house. And I walked up behind him. I just stood there. And in a minute, he went, I said, man, this is a great house. Show it to me. And he said, okay. So we walked through his house. I said, well, I'll see you Monday, and left. I wanted him to think about that all weekend. So first thing Monday morning, Frank comes in the office. He walks by my door and said, hey, Frank, come here. Let me talk with you. We closed the door. And I said, you know, I've been looking here, and you've been sick a lot on Fridays. And you've been working on your house. Well, there were some days I said, no, you've been working on your house and taking it off and marking it as sick leave. So here's what we're going to do. He was an avid deer hunter. He'd been saving vacation for deer hunting season. And I said, see all these days that are sick leave? And I had it documented. I had secretary pull it together, documented. And I said, see all these days? We're going to transfer those over to vacation. And he said, oh man, don't do that. I said, no, we're changing it to vacation. And furthermore, if you continue to use sick leave to work on your house, there's going to be some severe repercussions. You know, I may fire you. Now, this was before anybody else came in. And so he got up, he left, opened my door, went back to business. Now, a couple of things happened with that. Number one, Frank's health improved immensely. But the more important thing is that the morale in that organization went way up. Why? Because they had a manager before who was lax. He wasn't checking. He didn't really care that much, to be honest. And so they got discouraged. Like, if this is important, then why doesn't everybody have to perform? And I never said anything to anyone else. But do you think they figured out what had happened? They did. And so that day I moved from the hand to the head level. Now, it took a long time to move from the head level on up to the heart level with them. But you see, what the biggest impact was not on his health improving, but it was on morale improving in that organization. Now, how would that look in the church world? Well, you might be responsible for a Sunday school program and you've got one or two teachers. So what should you do? Have a teacher meeting and tell everybody how important it is to be on time and the kids are running around and disrupting? No, you go to those individuals and you explain to them, you know, you're a vital part of this, and when you're not here on time, let me tell you what happens. It interferes with everybody else. And can I count on you being on time? Now, if it's something you just can't do, then, you know, I understand, we'll find another teacher. But you have to hold people accountable. Now, you do everything right as a leader, so there will be no opposition, right? There will be opposition. It's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. And in 1 Peter it says, Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. My version of that is, you're not the Lone Ranger. I mean, you're going to have problems, and there's going to be trials, and there's going to be opposition. A lot of people think, if I'm in God's will, then there won't be opposition. Really? Was Christ in God's will? Did he have opposition? Most definitely. So you're going to have opposition. Now, going back to what we're using sort of track along this, Nehemiah had opposition. Things were going great. He took care of some internal problems with the people. And then there were 3 guys, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Gershom. And they were a thorn in his side. They did everything they could to try to defeat the rebuilding of the walls. What's the source of opposition? I know this. I've experienced it too many times. The more effective you're being, the more probability there's going to be oppositions. You remember we talked about in a previous session, in warfare, who do you go after? The leaders. So who do you think Satan's going to go after? He's going after the leaders. And so we need to understand that. But there's a way to handle that opposition, and this is what Nehemiah did. By the way, what's the best way to squelch opposition? Success. Now, we're jumping ahead here in Nehemiah 6 and 16. It says, "And it came to pass that when our enemies heard thereof, and all the heathen that were about us saw these things, they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought of our God." Nothing squelches opposition like being successful in what you're trying to accomplish. But from the point of opposition to the success, sometimes takes a while. So let's sort of look at some interim. If you look at what Nehemiah did, first thing he did was he took it to God in prayer. He consistently if you look at it and read through here, he consistently, every incident where there was a problem, he took it to God in prayer. He said, "God, you're going to have to help me here." And I can guarantee you, in a God-given vision, bigger than you can accomplish by yourself, it's going to involve people. And when you have people involved, it's going to get messy. And a phrase that we coined with some of our people is, "This is ministry, and ministry's messy." So there's going to be problems. There's going to be opposition. You start with taking it to the Lord in prayer. A couple of other, Hezekiah attacked by the Assyrians, and he got this letter from the Assyrians. And Hezekiah received the letter of the hand of the messengers, and he read it. And Hezekiah went up into the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. First thing he did. So when it comes, not if, when it comes, take it to the Lord in prayer. Second, persistence. Opposition will strengthen or weaken depending upon your response. What does that mean? What that means is you push harder. You're persistent. Nehemiah 4:21. After they had problems from these three guys, it says, "So we labored in the work. Half of them held the spears from the rising of the morning till the stars appeared." They redoubled their efforts. Persistence is absolutely necessary when you have opposition. If, as a leader, you fold at the first sign of opposition, you're not going to accomplish much. You're not going to accomplish God's vision God has for you. In fact, there's a verse over in Proverbs that says, if you fold, this is my paraphrase of it, in times of difficulty, then you're weak. It's easy to say, hard to do. Second, precaution. Precaution is prudent in facing opposition. Although efforts were redoubled during the rebuilding, precaution was taken to address any potential attack by the opposition. They worked with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other, and they posted guards. That's why I take the strategy of expect the best, prepare for the worst. Because you just need to be precautionary. That doesn't mean you end up with a negative attitude. That means that you're just precaution. Perspective is absolutely necessary to successfully confront opposition. How did, of course, these three, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Gershom, sent a letter to Nehemiah and said, come on down, we need to discuss some things. We've got some concerns for you. We want to help you. Of course, what they were doing was it was an ambush. What was Nehemiah's response? Great line to learn. I'm doing a great work so that I cannot come down. It's so easy sometimes with opposition to get overwhelmed and lose sight of the fact of what you're doing. You've heard the phrase, particularly in Louisiana, that you're so busy fighting alligators you forgot you came there to drain the swamp. And a lot of leaders can get caught up in this. They can see a booger behind every tree, and they can get diverted from what's the most important thing, and Satan uses diversionary tactics. And this is a great line to learn. I'm doing a great work, and I can't come down. Choose, as a leader, choose your battles wisely. There's some battles that just aren't worth the effort, and they aren't worth fighting. And as a leader, to be effective, you have a limited number of battles that you can really have the energy to engage in and to win. So just ask yourself, what difference does this make? And then presence. Stand firm, stand tall. Another approach, there was a gentleman by the name of Shemaiah who tried to get Nehemiah to run and hide. He said, these guys are after you, so why don't you go in the temple and hide? Now, as a leader, if you buckle under opposition and if you run and hide, what impact is that going to have on your followers? That's the difference between you guys take that hill and I'll stand back here and watch, or follow me and we're going to take the hill. So, presence. In other words, don't avoid the opposition, but stand tall. Now, some caveats. The leader must address opposition in a timely manner. Folks, most problems will not fix themselves. Generally, they'll get worse over time. And I've seen some leaders, when they knew there was a problem, but they kept hoping beyond hope that it would fix itself and they wouldn't have to confront someone. What generally happens in a situation like that? It gets worse and worse and worse. So, Nehemiah up front addressed the problems. All conflict cannot be prevented within an organization, but it can be managed. Now, another statement you may disagree with. Conflict can be a good thing. What? You got a corporation, I understand that, but what in the ministry? And sometimes conflict is necessary. Did Christ ever generate a conflict? He did it quite often. He generated conflicts. Now, I'm not saying just go out, because in Proverbs it says, don't tug on a dog's ear. Don't go out and just asking, borrowing trouble. But sometimes you may need to confront and generate a conflict. You just have to do that. But there is such thing as conflict management. And again, that's another subject for another time. But I teach about 6 hours on conflict management. Why? Because we got conflict. And it depends on how you manage it, not running from it. How would you manage conflict? Anticipate conflict and be prepared. You're naive if you think there never will be conflict. So you better anticipate it so you're not going to be blindsided and surprised. Try as much as possible to live peaceably with everyone. I love this verse in Romans 12 and 18. It says, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. It didn't say, live peaceably with all men. It said, if it be possible, as much as within you. So what does that lead you to think? You think there might be some people you're just not going to live peaceably with? That's true. That's true. But you live as much as possible peaceably. And then, how do you manage conflict? Just a little cameo here. Go back and look in Matthew chapter 18, verse 15 and 17, where Christ says, if you've got a problem, if someone's offended you, this is what you do. Now, it goes through a step process, but here's the concept in that. The concept is this. In any conflict, involve the fewest people possible. That's why the Lord says, if you have a problem with an individual, go to that individual yourself. Don't go tell somebody. Don't get your spouse all worked up. That's probably the worst thing you can do, because they're sort of prejudiced. Or at least I hope they are. But more people you get involved in a conflict, the more sticky it gets. And if you can go and just zero in on the fewest number of people, preferably you and that other person, sometimes it may be another person or two, but zero in on that, then that's your best chance of getting that conflict resolved. Now this might be freeing for you. Know that there are some people you will not be able to please. Here's another rule of thumb. You can write this down. It's pretty accurate. Within any organization, and this doesn't deviate from the church world to the corporate world, to the civic world, to the academic world. In any organization, there will be 5 to 7% of the people you cannot please. It doesn't matter what you do. You will never please them. If it's not too cold and not too hot, it's too just right. In other words, you're not going to please them. So what's your approach with that person or those people? Well, you don't write them off. But what you do is you can't spend a lot of time and effort on that 5 to 7% trying to please them when you know you're not going to please them. Why? What about the 95 to 93% that you're not spending time with because you're spending all of your time trying to please the 3 to 5%? It's not that you're not civil with them, but you just can't afford to spend a lot of time listening to their piddling problems. Now, when I was a young supervisor and had a little more, less gumption and more spunk, I put a sign on my office door. It says, would it offend you if I told you to take your silly problem down the hall? And that kept some people from coming in, because there were some people that kept bringing in silly problems. Of course, I learned pretty soon that's not the way to approach that. You can do that much more diplomatically. But you've got to understand that. You're not going to please everybody. And you better be careful. Let's talk about celebrating success. This is more or less the last step in execution process. Leaders particularly driven leaders, tend to move from one success, start another process again, and move on without properly celebrating. And it's important to celebrate successes if you're a leader. And what did Nehemiah do once they built the wall? They had a great celebration. They got the choir, brought them up on the wall, and they ate, enjoyed themselves, relaxed, praised God, listened to the good music, celebrated. Why is that important? Because as a leader, any success that you have is a direct result of God working through you. And you need to publicly acknowledge what God has done. You need to give Him the glory and give Him the praise. Second, any success a leader enjoys is a result of the efforts of those he leads. Those dedicated followers should be acknowledged both privately and publicly. Now that's one thing you want to do, privately and publicly. And one thing as a leader, a good friend of mine makes a statement that is really applicable, and this statement is, be loyal to the absent. In other words, don't talk about other people. And as a leader, you're accountable to someone, and if you're accountable to someone and things go wrong, don't go to who you're accountable to and say, well, all these goobers that you gave me to lead, it's their fault. Those things have a way of getting back. And if you were at the heart level, you just lost it. You went all the way, well, you got a revolt on your hands. Here's something to remember. If you're a leader, any failure, own it. Own it yourself. Now, you go back and talk to your leaders and you sort the wheat from the chaff and get things straightened out. But any failure, you own it. Any success, you give praise to your followers. You praise them. You say, I appreciate that, but the reason this could happen was because first God allowed it and these people made it happen. They need that affirmation. And then another reason is to build monuments. Reading in the Old Testament, do you remember how many times they refer back to the parting of the Red Sea? That's a monument. In fact, they did something really strange when they crossed over into the Promised Land. After they crossed the Jordan River on dry ground, Joshua said, hey, I want 12 of you guys, one from each tribe. I want you to go back to the center of the river and pick up a stone and bring them out and stack it up. Why? I mean, they were already over on the right side of the river. Here's why. Joshua chapter 4, verse 20. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, when your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean these stones? Then ye shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry ground. When God gives you success, you need to build a monument. Not to yourself, but to God. Not for your remembrance, but for other people to see and know that God did it. There's a church in Copenhagen, Bethel Baptist Church. I've had the opportunity to speak there a couple of times, and they do something that's really, really great. And I know some churches that do this, but they have an annual day where they celebrate what God has done for them. And they recount how that they did not have a pastor, and how for years they prayed for a pastor, and how God supplied that pastor, and how they met out in the parks and in public buildings, and they didn't have a place to meet, and how God gave them a church to meet in. It's that celebration, and they celebrate that. And as leaders, it's important that we celebrate that, to acknowledge God, to acknowledge our people. But if we don't celebrate successes, we demotivate our followers. This is what happened with David. Joab dressed David down in 2 Samuel chapter 19, 1 through 8. What had happened was Absalom, David's son, had led a revolt, and so David was fighting for his life, and Joab was commander of his forces. But David gave a command, said, don't kill Absalom. Well, Absalom got killed. David's army was victorious, and they were coming back to celebrate, and David was mourning. What effect do you think that had on them? They all just, it took the wind out of their sails. They just sort of started wandering off. And Joab went to David and said, David, get up and acknowledge the success. And as leaders, you know, it's not that we're in mourning. Sometimes it's just, I didn't think about it. Or sometimes it's, I'm so busy, I want to go on to the next one. You better acknowledge and celebrate those victories that God gives you. Why? To use it as a testimony to God Himself and others of God's greatness. Now, one caveat is that sometimes you can completely rely upon past successes. And there's an interesting story with Gideon. What happened with Gideon when he was victorious, they had an ephod, and people actually took that ephod and started worshiping it. In other words, you can worship the victory instead of worshiping God. And so they had it destroyed. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is celebrate your victories, but don't get so enamored with the good old days that you're not willing to go on to the next victory that God gives you. So, what's the process? In the vision, there's knowledge, burden, surrender, and revelation. In planning, there's development, and there's communication. And then, in the execution phase, there's the delegation, accountability, overcome opposition, and celebrating success. So, once you've gone through that, then what? You start right back at the beginning. You start at the beginning. God gives you a vision, and you get to the end of it, and sometimes you're very ambivalent about that. Like, I'm so thankful God allowed me the success, but now what do I do? Guess what? God has a bunch more in the hopper. And He says, if you're willing to be used, next time it'll be even bigger. That may be going to a new church. That may be coming off the mission field and doing some other things. That may be doing different things on the mission field. That may be in a corporation where you get pulled out and sign special projects. And, you know, there were times when, you know, I'd reached the heart level with some folks. And the company would say, well, that's great. Now we want you to take that and do it across the whole company. I had to pray about that. Back in my notes. Found those the other day, and it was 4:20 in the morning. God gave me peace about what I was to do to move on to another project. So you see, this process starts and it repeats and repeats and repeats. When does it end? When God takes us home. I don't believe in retirement. When I left the corporation where I worked for 30 years, the worst mistake I ever made was telling people I'm retiring. Because in their mind it was, oh, okay, so you're just going to do nothing. I said, no. I'm just going from one 24-hour a day, or two 12-hour day jobs to one 24-hour day job. So God never gives up. And if we're willing, He'll take us through this process time and time again. Let's take a break.